The man's voice rang out, sharp and angry. "You have no right to stop me." Every head in the museum turned. The security guard stood firm, hands steady, voice calm. "Sir, I need you to step back. You cannot enter this area without a ticket." The tourist scoffed. "You think you can tell me what to do?" The room went silent. People watched, unsure of what would happen next. But no one, not even the guard himself, was ready for what came next. Before we continue the story, let us know, where are you watching from? The security guard, Marcus, had worked at the museum for years. He knew every exhibit, every rule, and every type of visitor. Some were kind, some were curious, and some were like this man. Marcus took pride in his job. He had always believed that respect wasn't about status, it was about how you treated people. But today, that belief was about to be tested. The man in front of him was a tourist, entitled, impatient, and angry. He was in his late 40s, wearing an expensive watch and a smug expression. To him, Marcus wasn't a person. He was an obstacle. The museum itself was one of the most famous in the city, attracting visitors from all over the world. But right now, it felt small, tense, uncomfortable. Other tourists stood nearby, pretending not to watch, but Marcus could feel their eyes. Some whispered, some glanced at their phones, but no one spoke up. Not yet. The tourist took a step forward, crossing a line he shouldn't have. Marcus stayed calm. "Sir, I need you to step back." The man sneered. "And if I don't?" Marcus knew this moment would decide everything, because in just a few seconds, the entire crowd was going to react. The tension in the museum was thick. People stopped mid-step, their conversations dying out as they turned to watch the scene unfold. Marcus kept his stance firm, his voice steady. "Sir, I need you to step back. Museum policy requires all visitors to have a ticket before entering restricted areas." The tourist scoffed, crossing his arms. "Oh, so now you're a cop? You think you have power over me?" He laughed, but it was not friendly. It was the kind of laugh that sent a message. "I don't respect you." Marcus had dealt with difficult visitors before, but something about this man was different. He wasn't just rude. He was trying to humiliate him. "Sir, this is not about power. It's about following the rules." The tourist leaned in, his voice lowering to a sharp whisper. "I don't take orders from people like you." Marcus felt the shift in the air. The insult hung between them, unspoken yet clear as day. He could hear the murmurs spreading through the crowd. "Did he just say that?" someone whispered. "This is getting out of hand," another person muttered. A woman in the back gasped. But the tourist didn't care. His confidence grew as he saw Marcus's calm expression. He mistook self-control for weakness. "You think you're better than me, huh?" The man smirked, stepping even closer. "Let me tell you something. I pay for experiences like this. People like me keep places like this running. And you're just here to take orders and do as you're told." Marcus inhaled slowly, keeping his composure. This wasn't new. This wasn't even surprising. But it still stung. A young woman standing nearby clenched her fists. Someone should say something. A teenage boy whispered to his father, "Why isn't anyone stopping him?" Marcus remained calm. He knew reacting emotionally would only make things worse. But the tourist, he wanted a reaction. "You know what? I don't think you belong here at all," the man continued, his voice louder now, his confidence growing as he saw that no one had stepped in to stop him. "I bet you don't even know half the history in this place. You're just some guy standing in a uniform, pretending to have authority." Marcus exhaled. He had one job, to de-escalate. But before he could respond, something unexpected happened. The crowd, which had been watching in silence, suddenly came to life. A man in a suit stepped forward. "That's enough. You're out of line." A woman near the entrance raised her voice. "You're embarrassing yourself. Just follow the rules like everyone else." The teenage boy who had whispered to his father spoke up, his voice shaking but determined. "Why do you think you're better than him? He's just doing his job." And just like that, the power shifted. The tourist, who had spent the last few minutes feeling untouchable, now found himself surrounded by judgmental stares. His smirk faded. His shoulders stiffened. Marcus met his eyes, his voice still calm. "Are you done?" The tourist looked around. He wasn't in control anymore. He was outnumbered. And for the first time since he started his tirade, he looked nervous. Someone pulled out their phone. Another person started recording. A man whispered, "This is going online." A woman next to him nodded. "Let him talk. The internet will handle the rest." The tourist swallowed hard. Marcus didn't move. He didn't need to. The crowd had taken over. One by one, voices rose. "Apologize. Leave. Show some respect. You wouldn't treat him like this if he looked like you." The tourist's face turned red. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had lost. Marcus, still calm, gave him one last chance. "Are you ready to leave now?" The tourist exhaled sharply, his hands clenching at his sides. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed toward the exit. The doors slammed behind him. Silence, then applause. It started with one person, then another, and another, until the entire museum erupted into cheers. Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the man in the suit nodding at him. "You handled that well, better than most would." Marcus gave a small smile. "It's not the first time." The man shook his head. "And that's the problem." The young woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward. "You shouldn't have to deal with things like that alone. We all should have said something sooner." Marcus looked around. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. "Thank you," he said. The crowd began to disperse, but the energy in the room had changed. People weren't just leaving with stories of the museum's history. They were leaving with a lesson about respect, about speaking up, about knowing when silence is just another form of complicity. And as Marcus went back to work, standing tall at his post, he knew this moment wouldn't be forgotten, not by him, not by the crowd, and certainly not by the man who had just learned that the world had no patience for his ignorance. The museum had returned to its usual rhythm, but the tension from earlier still lingered. People whispered in hushed voices, glancing toward the security desk where Marcus stood composed but aware. The entitled tourist had stormed out, humiliated by the overwhelming crowd response. But even as the doors slammed behind him, Marcus knew this moment wasn't over. He had been doing this job for years, and he had learned something important. It's never just about one incident. It's about the pattern, the assumptions, the everyday moments that remind people like him that, to some, he would never be more than a uniform. But today had been different. Marcus could still hear the applause ringing in his ears, the way the crowd had spoken up, the way they had refused to let the moment pass unnoticed. And now, something was about to happen that would change everything. From across the museum floor, a man in a navy blue blazer approached with measured steps. The museum director. The room stilled again. People who had started to move on paused, watching. Marcus stood taller. He knew this man well enough, Mr. Harrison, the museum director, known for being reserved, precise, and highly selective about when he got involved. The fact that he was walking directly toward Marcus meant one thing: this wasn't over yet. The director stopped in front of him, adjusting his tie. His expression was unreadable. "That was quite the scene," he said. Marcus nodded, keeping his tone neutral. "Yes, sir." Mr. Harrison let out a slow breath. "And you handled it well." A few whispers flickered through the crowd. Some had expected Marcus to get in trouble. Others had wondered if the museum would pretend this never happened. But no one had expected this. Marcus met the director's gaze, staying professional. "I was just doing my job." The director studied him for a long moment. Then he turned slightly, addressing the remaining visitors. "This museum stands for history, knowledge, and respect. What happened today, what all of you witnessed, was a reminder that history isn't just something we look at in exhibits. It's something we shape every day." A murmur spread through the crowd. Marcus could feel it. The shift. He had spent years feeling invisible in moments like this. People watched, sure. They whispered, they judged, but they rarely did more than that. Today had been different. The director turned back to him. "Marcus, how long have you worked here?" Marcus didn't hesitate. 5 years. "And in those 5 years, how many times have you dealt with situations like this?" Marcus hesitated this time. Then, with quiet honesty, he said, "Too many to count." The director nodded, as if he already knew the answer. He glanced around at the crowd once more. "I've run this museum for over 20 years. I've seen incidents like today before, but I've never seen a security guard handle one with as much patience, restraint, and professionalism as you did." Marcus stayed silent. The director took a step closer. "I can't stop people like that tourist from walking through our doors, but I can make sure that the people who protect this museum, who dedicate their time and effort to making this place welcoming, are given the respect they deserve." Marcus frowned slightly, unsure of what was coming next. Then the director smiled. Not a small smile, a real one. "Starting today, I am promoting you to head of security." The museum fell completely silent. Then, applause. It started small, but it grew. Some people clapped, others cheered. A young woman wiped a tear from her eye. The teenage boy who had spoken up earlier turned to his father. "Did that just really happen?" His father smiled. "Yeah, son, and it was about time." Marcus, still processing, finally spoke. "Sir, Mr. Harrison held up a hand. "You don't have to say anything yet, but I need people like you leading this team, and I need someone like you to help shape a new policy, one that makes it very clear that this museum will not tolerate discrimination of any kind." More murmurs, more understanding. Marcus realized something at that moment. This was bigger than him. This wasn't just about a job title. This was about changing the way things worked. Marcus looked at the director. "I'd be honored, sir." The applause rose again. The crowd had come expecting to see art and history, but they had witnessed something much bigger. They had witnessed a shift, a reminder that silence is a choice. And today, they had chosen to speak. Aftermath. As the museum finally returned to normal, Marcus took a moment to himself. A familiar voice caught his attention. It was the young woman who had spoken up earlier. She approached with a hesitant but warm smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "For what?" Marcus asked. She took a deep breath. "For handling it the way you did, and for showing people like me that we don't always have to take it, that we're worth more than how people like that treat us." Marcus felt something warm in his chest. "You are," he said. She smiled, nodding before walking away. Marcus turned back toward the museum floor. His job wasn't over. If anything, this was just the beginning. Because today, respect had won. The museum floor had finally settled. The murmur of conversations returned, but something was different. People weren't just looking at the exhibits anymore. They were looking at Marcus. He had been standing at his post for years, unseen, unnoticed, just part of the background. But today, people saw him. As he adjusted his security badge, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Excuse me." Marcus turned. A woman in a sleek business suit walked toward him. Confident, purposeful, unshaken. The crowd around them seemed to pause again. They had already witnessed one unexpected turn of events, but they had no idea another was coming. The woman stopped in front of him, smiling. "It's good to finally meet you, Marcus." Marcus frowned slightly. He had never seen her before. "Do I know you?" She extended her hand. "My name is Rebecca Simmons. I work for the museum board." The museum board. The whispers started again. Marcus shook her hand, still unsure of what was happening. "It's nice to meet you, ma'am." Rebecca studied him for a moment. "I saw what happened earlier, and I want to thank you for the way you handled it." Marcus nodded. "Just doing my job." Rebecca smiled. "That's the thing, Marcus. You're doing far more than just a job." Marcus tilted his head, waiting. Rebecca glanced at the director, who gave her a small nod. Then she turned back to Marcus. "We've been discussing some big changes here at the museum," she said. "New policies, a new vision. And today, you just proved exactly why we need them." Marcus stayed silent. He had spent his career being ignored by people like her. Now, she was offering him something. Rebecca took a breath. The museum board has decided to create a head of visitor relations position, someone who not only oversees security but also ensures that every guest and every employee is treated with the respect they deserve. She smiled. "And we want you to take it." Silence. Then, shock. The remaining visitors turned to one another in disbelief. Even Marcus needed a second to process what he had just heard. You want me?" he asked, voice steady. Rebecca nodded. "You've proven that leadership isn't just about authority. It's about integrity. You showed that today." The museum director stepped forward. "Marcus, this isn't just a promotion. It's a chance to change things, to make sure no one else goes through what you did today." For the first time in his career, Marcus felt something unfamiliar. Power. Not the kind that came from a badge or a uniform, the kind that came from being valued. Marcus exhaled, then met Rebecca's gaze. "I'll do it," he said. And just like that, everything changed. Marcus had spent years in this museum, watching people pass by without a second glance. He had accepted that his role, while important, was always going to be unseen. But today, everything changed. The moment the words left Rebecca's mouth, offering him the new head of visitor relations position, he felt the weight of all those years lift. He wasn't just another employee anymore. He was someone they trusted to lead. The museum crowd, still lingering, erupted into quiet murmurs. Some people smiled, nodding in approval. Others whispered in disbelief. How often do security guards get promoted to leadership? Marcus took a breath, shaking Rebecca's hand firmly. "I appreciate this, more than I can say." Rebecca gave him a knowing smile. "It's not a favor, Marcus. You earned this." The museum director, Mr. Harrison, chimed in. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about ensuring that this museum represents the values we claim to stand for. And you're the right person to help us do that." Marcus nodded, still taking it all in. "One more thing," Rebecca added. We'd like you to help us develop new policies on how we handle visitor conduct, so this kind of thing never happens again." That was when it really hit Marcus. This wasn't just a promotion. This was a chance to make real change, a chance to ensure that no one else would ever have to stand alone in a moment like he had. The same woman who had spoken up earlier, the one who had been near tears, approached him. "I hope you know how much today meant to people like me," she said softly. Marcus turned to her, seeing the emotion in her eyes. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "I've been in situations like this before. I've watched people like that tourist, people who think they can treat others like they're less than them, get away with it. But today was different. Because today, someone stood up. And more importantly, people followed." Marcus felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. She was right. The real power of today wasn't just in what he had done. It was in the fact that the crowd had refused to stay silent. It wasn't just his victory. It was theirs. The teenage boy who had spoken up earlier approached as well. He looked nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say, I wish I had done more." Marcus shook his head. "You spoke up. That's more than most people do." The boy nodded, still looking unsure. "Yeah, but I could have said something sooner. I was scared." Marcus studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Courage isn't about never being scared. It's about speaking up even when you are." The boy's father placed a hand on his shoulder, nodding in agreement. Around them, other visitors began to step forward. Some simply offered a handshake. Others whispered their own stories of injustice. One elderly man sighed. "I've seen moments like this before, and too many times, people just let it happen. I'm glad today wasn't one of those times." A woman with a camera smiled. "You know this is already all over social media, right?" Marcus chuckled. "I figured as much." Rebecca laughed. "You're about to go viral, Marcus. Hope you're ready for it." Marcus shook his head, still in disbelief. A few hours ago, he was just another security guard. Now, he was a symbol, not because he had fought back, but because he had stood his ground, because he had refused to be made small, and because, finally, the world had listened. As the museum finally returned to its usual rhythm, Marcus took his place at his new post. His nameplate would change, his title would change, but one thing wouldn't: his commitment to standing up for what was right. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't given based on who you are. It's based on how you treat others. And today, a whole museum had learned that lesson. Marcus took a deep breath as he looked around the museum. The same building he had worked in for years now felt different. People who had once walked past him without a glance now acknowledged him. They smiled. They nodded. Some even stopped to shake his hand. He had always done his job with integrity. He had always stood firm. But today, for the first time, people had seen it. More than that, they had responded. The power of today wasn't in the humiliation of a man who thought he was untouchable. It wasn't even in the promotion or the applause. It was in the fact that people had chosen to stand up. For once, silence hadn't won. Marcus knew that this moment would fade from headlines. The internet would move on. But the lesson, that would stay. Respect isn't about power, it's about decency. It's about knowing that no one is above treating others with dignity. And today, one museum had learned that lesson in a way they'd never forget. Have you ever spoken up when it would have been easier to stay quiet? Or do you remember a moment when someone defended you? Tell us your story in the comments. And remember, how you treat people when no one is watching says everything about who you are.